We've covered a few parts of the Chemical Wedding in earlier videos, but today I'd like to focus on the book's fifth day, when Christian Rosenkreutz, led by his page, explores the king's treasury in the dungeon of the castle and sees the sepulcher, Lady Venus, and then has an encounter with her son Cupid. The page leads Christian through a door, a dark passage, then another door, into a place called the King's Treasury, Thesaurus Regis. They then enter a sepulcher, defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a small room in which a dead person lies. This sepulcher was triangular and had in the middle of it a kettle of polished copper. The rest was of pure gold and precious stones. In the kettle stood an angel, who held in his arms an unknown tree, from which it continually dropped into the kettle. And as oft as the fruit fell into the kettle, it turned into water too, and ran out from thence into 3 small golden kettles standing by. We'll see that the dead or dormant person housed in this sepulcher is Lady Venus. In the margin of the text it reads, Thalamus Veneris Sepulte, which translates to the burial chamber of Venus. But if we parse out these Latin words, we find that Thalamus Veneris means come to the room, which is precisely what Christian has done, and it's as if he's been summoned to do so. Here, the Chemical Wedding is speaking to mental alchemy, the process of elevating energy through the tree trunk of the chakras in the torso through meditation to enter a specific place or room of the mind. We use the term thalamus to describe a part of the brain located in the center between the 2 dualistic hemispheres, and in Latin, thalamus means room. So the personal alchemical symbolism here is that Christian is moving his energy to his thalamus room. Normally we think of moving energy up the chakras to the pineal gland, and that gland is involved in this process, but it's important to realize that the thalamus room is also a part of this process. Because the pineal gland is cone-shaped, it's usually symbolized by the pine cone, and we've seen depictions of the pine tree in the work of Bacon and Shakespeare, including the cloven pine of The Tempest. The tree here in the castle's sepulcher is said to be unknown, but it's possible that it could be some type of pine or conifer. And although it's said to be dropping its fruit into the copper kettle, the internet tells us that a pine cone is considered a fruit, a woody fruit that contains seeds. Fire opens a pine cone to release its seeds, especially in serotinous pines, where, according to Google, the cones are sealed with resin that only melts when exposed to high heat from a fire. This trait is called serotiny, and it's interesting that the root of sero shows up in the word serotonin. In the Chemical Wedding, fire has a role with regard to the tree in this scene of the story. On every corner there burned a small taper of pyrites, of which I had before taken no notice, for the fire was so clear that it looked much liker a stone than a taper. From this heat the tree was forced continually to melt, yet it still produced new fruit. Pyrite, of which these tapers were made, is a mineral composed of iron and sulfur. The root pyre means fire and describes a feature of pyrite. It produces a spark when struck by metal. Melatonin, produced by the pineal gland, also has the effect of lowering the body's core temperature. And it's interesting that we're presented here with the lowering and raising of temperatures. Google tells us that serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. The root sero in Latin means late, as the seeds of serotinous pines are held for years until a fire releases them. And the root mela is widely understood to mean black, but that's from Greek etymology. In Latin, the root mela meant apple. In Latin, might the hormones of serotonin and melatonin be symbolically pointing to late apples? And are these late apples the symbolic pine cones dropping as fruit? In his essay on Cupid, The Atom, Francis Bacon saw the infant god as the representation of seeds. He is elegantly described with perpetual infancy or childhood, because compound bodies, they seem greater and more stricken in years, whereas the first seeds of things, or atoms, they are little and diminute, and also in their infancy. He is also well feigned to be naked, because all compound bodies, to a man rightly judging, seem to be apparelled and clothed, and nothing to be properly naked but the first particles of things. Next, Christian is led from this thalamus room through a trap door and down some stairs, a path that seems to be patterned after the positioning of the pineal gland in relation to the thalamus. Herewith I espied a rich bed, ready-made, hung about with curious curtains, one of which he drew, where I saw the Lady Venus stark naked, for he heaved up the coverlets too, lying there in such beauty and a fashion so surprising that I was almost besides myself. So she was again covered, and the curtain drawn before her, yet she was still in my eye. Christian pinpoints her location in his own head, and it's not within his two eyes used for vision, it's his single eye, the pineal gland's mystical designation in Eastern religions as the third eye. The two drapes covering Venus, the curtains and the coverlets, seem to correspond to the dura and pia mater, the outermost and innermost layers, respectively, of the membrane protecting the brain. Dura mater means, in Latin, hard mother, while pia mater, the name of the inner layer, means pious mother, as if being closer to the inner sanctum of this temple of the brain makes this one more pious. And of course the very concept of matter is derived from the term for mother. Venus is mother to Cupid, and like her son, she's associated with love and attraction. In Bacon's essay on Cupid, he writes that these two are working toward the same purpose, to compound or bond, which is what a chemical wedding also achieves. For Venus doth generally stir up a desire of conjunction and procreation, and Cupid her son doth apply this desire to some individual nature, so that the general disposition comes from Venus, the more exact sympathy from Cupid. But in addition to piercing couples with his arrow to attract them to one another, Cupid has another purpose, to increase temperature, and it's because of Cupid that these pyrite tapers are burning. But this is where the allegory shifts from spiritual or mental alchemy to the manipulation of metals. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 153, a maid of the goddess Diana douses Cupid's love-kindling fire with cold water, and Cupid reignites his fire in the single eye of the author's mistress, which borrowed from this holy fire of love a dateless, lively heat still to endure. Cupid is in the business of kindling burning love, and his lively heat is also mentioned in the 1691 semi-opera King Arthur. "'Tis I that have warmed ye. In spite of cold weather I've brought ye together. 'Tis I that have warmed ye." But Cupid doesn't just use fire to incorporate human hearts. He also uses it to incorporate metals. We get a glimpse of this in the Chymical Wedding, when he uses fire to warm his arrow. "Yet can I not," said Cupid, "let it pass unrevenged, that you were so near stumbling upon my dear mother." With that he put the point of his dart into one of the little tapers, and heating it a little, pricked me with it on the hand. Because Cupid's source of warmth is fire, two plays from the 1600s compare a weak or failing Cupid to a scarecrow, a symbol easily threatened by fire. One play to do this is Cupid's Revenge, where the god Cupid is being erased from the culture of Lycia as a vain and fruitless superstition, and Cupid's statues and temples are being removed. Priest, do not stare. I must deface your temple, though unwilling, and your god Cupid here must make a scarecrow. Another play to make this comparison is Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where Benvolio says, "We'll have no Cupid hoodwinked with a scarf, bearing a Tartar's painted bow of lathe, scaring the ladies like a crow-keeper." In both of these examples, Cupid is failing at his job. He's accused of being a lazy god in one, and scaring rather than luring the ladies in the other. But combining this symbol of a scarecrow with Benvolio's mention of a Tartar's painted bow reveals that this line is a reference to Tartaria and the information John Frampton presented in his 1580 book, A Discovery of the Countries of Tartaria, Scythia, and Cataia. Frampton's book details an odd burial ritual involving filling with hay the skin of the deceased person or the skin of a dead horse, essentially creating what we'd call a scarecrow today. I've speculated in another video that this ritual likely spawned the concept of the corporate straw man, because among the Tartars, the hay-filled body served as a token for one buried. This is exactly how the legal corporate straw man functions, as a token for another, conjoining two legal entities into one. So the incorporating Cupid, when failing at his job to incorporate man and woman, shifts into incorporating the straw man or scarecrow with the living man. Like Cupid, the wild, barbarous Tartars, who used straw men as incorporated tokens, also understood metallurgy. They'd been gathering information about it from the Chinese since the 10th century, and as such, the Tartars were reported to have adorned their costumes with gold and forged metal arrows and knives. But this passage from Frampton's book reveals something interesting. They, the Tartars, take it for a heinous matter to cast a knife into the fire, or touch the fire therewith, or take the meat out of the pot with a knife. Why would they be anxious to keep their knives out of the fire? Probably because their knives weren't tempered. As Google tells us, an untempered knife will likely melt in a fire. Without tempering, the steel is much softer and more susceptible to melting when exposed to high heat. The act of tempering involves heating the metal to a specific temperature below its melting point, and then allowing it to cool slowly, a slightly different process than incorporating metals into alloys, which involves melting the base metal followed by rapid cooling. Slow cooling is known as annealing and is used to soften metals and make them more malleable, whereas rapid cooling is used to harden metals. What the Tartars were anxious to protect their knives from was the act of cupellation, a metallurgical process that separates metals in ores and alloys by heating them to high temperatures. Cupellation is the act of melting at high heat to separate, rather than melting and cooling to incorporate. Cupellation is the alchemical dissolution that undoes the chemical wedding. The two words, Cupid and cupellation, seem like they might be related. In fact, this is where I first suspected that Cupid was a little god of metallurgy, a god of alloy incorporation, and that his function was simply later applied to the human act of incorporation, of wedding. The etymology of cupellation claims to go back to the Latin word cuppa, meaning the cupel or vessel in which the metal assays were performed. But I think it's doubtful that cupel and cupellation derive from cuppa for two reasons. First, because there's another Latin word with much more relevance to the act of high heat separation and alchemy, cupio, meaning to smoke, boil, or move violently. My second reason is that the word cupio is much older than the word cuppa, a term from late Latin between the 3rd to 6th centuries AD. There's archaeological evidence of cupellation relics from the Bronze Age, suggesting its use as early as the 4th millennium BC. And that corresponds to the age of the word cupio, which comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, a linguistic system dating from 4500 BC. Cupio, then, could easily have been the term actually used during cupellation in the Bronze Age to mean a violent boil that would produce the heat necessary for melting. Once again, etymological resources have either been lying to us or have been lazy in their research. But the word cupio evolved in classical Latin to also mean to desire or long for, very much in keeping with the state Cupid is known to generate. The fact that cupio evolved to mean I want, and Cupid means greedy, also suggests that these two words, and by extension cupellation, are likely related terms. In fact, Cupid's role is usually to bring an unwilling partner into a romantic coupling. If a man rejects a woman, just shoot him with Cupid's arrow, and then he'll join with her. In the world of metallurgy, gold is that unwilling partner, as Saint Germain writes in Discourse 7 of the I Am Discourses. Gold does not long for nor adhere to anything else. All other metals or alloys cling to it. Gold is this way because it is of a pure element. Since gold is an unwilling partner, it requires the flaming arrow of Cupid to be coaxed into the bonding involved in a gold alloy or a gold telluride like calaverite or sylvanite. Tellurides are naturally occurring, but in metallurgy the purpose of creating a gold alloy is to harden what is otherwise a soft metal. And this brings up something interesting. While gold is incorporated with other metals to harden it, a tartrate is used to soften metals. Tartrate is a salt of tartaric acid, and tartrate is also known as tartar. Does that make it Tartarian? Tartar salt forms naturally in wine casks and on wine bottle corks when potassium binds with tartaric acid, and tartrates are especially likely to form if the wine is cooled below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a wine on the market today made from black Tartarian cherries, and these cherries have been cultivated since at least the early 1700s in Circassia, Russia. On this Mercator map from 1595, the land bounded with pink is designated as all one place, with the name Tartaria here in the center. This pink boundary reaches right up to the eastern shore of the Black Sea, where Circassia was located, in the area we currently call Georgia. Frampton's 1580 book tells us that 200 years earlier, in the late 1300s, about this time, they, meaning the Tartars, overcame and brought into subjection to them the Georgians. Further down on page 12 it states that when these Georgians would enter into battle, they accustomed to drink a bottle of wine that they used to carry with them. Was this wine made from Tartarian cherries? It seems likely. Cherry wine will produce tartrate crystals, just as grape wines do. So might the tartrate crystals that are a natural byproduct of wine have been named from this form of Tartarian wine? It's certainly possible. And although tartaric acid wasn't discovered until 1769, the ancient Greeks were aware of tartar in a partially purified form. According to Panzarasa in his 2015 paper, Rediscovering Pyrotartaric Acid, the formation of tartar during vinification has been known since ancient times. It was initially called feex vini, meaning wine sediment, and the word tartarus began to appear in the alchemical literature in the 11th century. Much later alchemists of the 15, 16, and 1700s were fascinated by tartarus, and Blaise de Vigenère wrote in the 1500s that tartar was one of the subjects which those who experiment with fire greatly abuse. Johannes de Monte Snyder in the 1600s wrote, "By means of tartar, the metals are changed into living mercury, and this happens because, while quantitatively the salt is increased, the earth begins to predominate until the bond is broken." We could take out all the details in the middle and just say, by means of tartar, the bond is broken. This is alchemy, dissolution, breaking the bonds of the chemical wedding. In 1655, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont specifically noted the usefulness of tartarus in the act of dissolution in Ortus Medicinae. If you cannot attain this arcanum of fire, i.e. the alkahest, learn then to make salt of tartar volatile and complete your dissolutions by means of it. He also mentioned that tartarus from wine was used to make ink, which showed that it wasn't the wine but the dregs or sediments of the wine that produced the color. Today, tartaric acid is still used in gold and silver plating, the cleaning of metals, and making the blue ink for blueprints. But why were the alchemists experimenting with fire abusing tartar? Maybe because tartar salt can lower the melting point of metals. Fluxum nigrum is made from the partial calcination, heating at high temperature with restricted oxygen, of tartar for the purpose of creating a melting agent, a flux to lower the melting point. Now let's decode the strange symbols Christian Rosenkreuz sees inside the sepulcher. This sepulcher was triangular and had in the middle of it a kettle of polished copper. The rest was of pure gold and precious stones. In the kettle stood an angel who held in his arms an unknown tree, from which it continually dropped into the kettle. And as oft as the fruit fell into the kettle, it turned into water too, and ran out from thence into 3 small golden kettles standing by. The kettle is made of copper because copper is the metal associated with Venus. Not only that, but its symbol on the table of elements is Cu, from its Latin name cuprum, another name that seems connected to Cupid, cupel, and cupellation. In the early 1600s, a kettle wasn't necessarily a container with a spout for boiling water. It was also a large vessel for cooking food, and although this kettle is most definitely fictional and symbolic, this concave kettle is the only type in which an angel could stand and be visible. Placing the angel in the kettle is somewhat like having the angel stand in a pit. And recall that Tartarus, in addition to being a deity and a wine sediment, is also a concave pit, known as the underworld of ancient Greece. According to this mythology website, the combination of the sky's arch and the underworld's bowl frame reality itself. Tartarus was envisaged as the opposite of the sky, an inverted dome lying beneath the flat earth. Together, the Uranian dome, Uranos being the primordial god of the sky, and Tartarian pit enclosed the entire cosmos in an egg-shaped or spherical shell. What this all suggests is that the kettle is copper tartarus, or copper tartrate. Copper is used in alloys to improve the malleability of metals, a function of tartrate, but copper tartrate specifically is used in electroplating metals, attracting and binding gold or silver to the surface of another metal, a very Cupid-like project. Electroplating wasn't possible in 1616 when the Chemical Wedding was published, but other forms of plating base metals with gold and silver had been performed since at least medieval times. And Palafox writes of silver-plated prizes given to Tartarian soldiers well before modern electroplating was developed. The angel standing in the copper tartrate kettle would likely be Haniel, the archangel associated with Venus. This angel is also associated with a ray of turquoise light, in keeping with copper's turquoise patina and the blue-green color of copper tartrate, and is described sometimes as male, sometimes female. Variants of the name Haniel include Anil or Anil, which are homophones of the word anneal, meaning to heat a metal and allow it to cool slowly in order to make it more malleable, just like many tartrate compounds. In the arms of the angel is a tree forced to continually melt as it drops fruit. Cupid is attempting to completely melt the tree with his tapers. So why would he do this? Wood doesn't melt, but that's because its melting point is higher than its combustion point. It'll burn before it melts. So what Cupid needs here is a melting agent to lower wood's melting point, again pointing to the function of tartar salt compounds like fluxum nigrum. Next in the story, the page explains to Christian the need for the tree to melt. "Now behold," said the page, "what I heard revealed to the king by Atlas. When the tree shall be quite melted down, then shall Lady Venus awake and be the mother of a king." We might assume that this means that Cupid, as the child of Venus, will be elevated to the status of a king. But in the process of plating one metal with another, the king refers to gold as the most desirable metal that can be used in that process. The mother in the plating process refers to the second-generation metal plate acting like a mold. So Cupid here seems to be facilitating a metallurgical process of molding gold plate in the image of Venus using the melting agent of Tartarus. And I wonder if this function of tartar salt and its natural production in Tartarian cherries might have something to do with the scrubbing of Tartaria from modern historical records and maps. There may be something really powerful and useful in Tartarus, tartar salt, especially in the Earth's grid system and its natural production of energy. I don't claim to know what that is, but it's another area of research that might prove beneficial. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.